Hey everyone, my name is Brady Whitten and this is The Word Meets the World for October 27th, 2021. So the U.S. national debt has been in the news recently as earlier this month, President Biden signed legislation that temporarily raised the U.S. debt ceiling by $480 billion, raising it to a new high of $28.9 trillion. Without the increase, Department of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen reported that the federal government would run out of money to pay the nation's bills. And even with this increase, the Fed is still projected to hit the cap again in December of 2021. So the national debt level has been a significant subject of controversy in the U.S. for decades. But what does the Bible have to say about debt, and how should we as Christians approach this subject? That's our topic for this week's The Word Meets the World. So according to usdebtclock.org, the U.S. national debt currently stands at about $28.9 trillion, which is more than double the debt to GDP ratio that our nation had in the year 2000. According to the Peterson Foundation, the increase in debt is being driven by three things: our aging population and increased spending on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, rising healthcare costs, and inadequate sources of revenue. So arguments about who's to blame have become a regular part of U.S. politics, and both parties often threaten to shut down the government as they point the finger at others for unnecessary spending and mismanagement. Those concerned with excessive government debt say that it impacts economic stability and has ramifications for the strength of our currency, economic growth, and unemployment. Others say the national debt is manageable and that people should stop worrying about it. But again, what does the Bible say about debt, and how should we as Christians approach the subject? As is the case with many contemporary issues, the Bible does not address the question of national debt directly. But there are passages and teachings that talk about borrowing and lending, about interest, and about people's relationship to money in general. So let's take a look at some of these passages and teachings. So one thing the Bible is very clear about and encourages is the wise use of money. For example, encouraging prudence and frugality, Proverbs 21:20 says, "Precious treasure remains in the house of the wise, but the fool devours it." Encouraging patience in building wealth, Proverbs 13:11 says, "Wealth hastily gotten will dwindle, but those who gather little by little will increase it." Jesus himself speaks about the human relationship to money quite often, and he warns us about the hold that money can have on our hearts and encourages us in the practice of generosity. In the Gospel of Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 6:24, Jesus says this, "No one can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and wealth." So the Bible encourages the wise use of money. It encourages us to guard our hearts. But the Bible does not forbid going into debt. It does caution us about using debt, however. So Proverbs 22:7 says, "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender." And in a fascinating passage from the prophet Habakkuk, he says this, "Alas, for you who heap up what is not your own. How long will you load yourselves with goods taken in pledge? Will not your own creditors suddenly rise, and those who make you tremble wake up? Then you will be booty for them." Christian financial guru Dave Ramsey suggests it's okay to borrow money for things that are assets, things like homes or businesses. But when it comes to debt for other things, we should avoid it and live within our means. Don't buy things you can't afford with money you don't have to impress people you don't like, he says. So as we would expect, the Bible also teaches that it would be wrong for us to take on debt and then not repay it. Psalm 37:21 says, "The wicked borrow and do not pay back, but the righteous are generous and keep giving." So the Bible does not only offer guidance for the borrower, but it offers instructions for those who make loans as well. In Deuteronomy 23, verses 19 and 20, we read this: "You shall not charge interest on loans to another Israelite, interest on money, interest on provisions, interest on anything that is lent. On loans to a foreigner you may charge interest, but on loans to another Israelite you may not charge interest." So in keeping with the biblical warning about debt, this passage suggests that collecting interest is not good for the person to whom the loan is made. So the Israelites are commanded not to charge one another interest when making a loan. It's a way of acting in the other's best interest. In addition, one of the Bible's clearest teachings about lending has to do with lending to the poor. And for this, we're going to turn to Exodus 22, and this is verses 25 and 20 through 27. "If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down. For it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. In what else shall that person sleep?" So again, this is in keeping with one of the primary concerns of the Bible, and that is justice and care for the poor. Since lending and borrowing money at interest can be harmful, we should be extra diligent with how it affects the most vulnerable in our midst. So these are some of the Bible's teachings about money and about debt. But how might we apply these teachings to the growing national debt in the U.S.? So first, as we've seen, the Bible does not forbid debt, but it does caution us about its use. Wise financial management begins with living within or close to our means. For the U.S., this would mean reducing expenses through better management and budget cuts, and increasing revenue by growing the economy and/or by increasing taxes. But of course, we all know no politician wants to be the one to tell Americans that if we need to get the debt under control, that we need to tighten our belt or pay more taxes. If we really want to get the national debt under control, then it requires us as citizens to encourage and to support wise financial management from our leaders, and to be willing to take hard decisions and the sacrifice that will come with it. With that said, the biblical warnings about debt have to do with potential harm that debt can cause. Even debt hawks like Dave Ramsey make space for using debt when it's appropriate, again, in securing things like assets, homes, businesses. So with a nation and economy of our size, some debt is probably inevitable, and if used wisely can be of benefit. Borrowing money to improve infrastructure, to invest in medical research or other technology may be a wise use of debt. A good guiding principle, I think, comes from the Methodist general rules, and one of those general rules is this: do no harm. And finally, there's no doubt that if we want to approach this issue from a biblical perspective, we must make care for the poor and vulnerable a high priority. Despite the fact that welfare programs like unemployment and food stamps account for a small percent of our national budget, when talking about reducing the national debt, talk often turns to reducing and cutting these types of programs. While we should always seek to manage these programs as wisely as possible and prevent people from abusing them, from a biblical perspective, it's programs like these, ones that care for the poor, that should be the last thing on the cutting room floor. In the words of Pulitzer Prize-winning author Pearl Buck, the true test of a civilization is the way that it cares for and helps its members. So what do you think about all this? I do want to leave you, like I always do, with a few discussion questions. If you're with a group, these will help you to dig into the topic a little more deeply, and these may also be things that you want to think about on your own. But before I put those questions up, I want to ask you again to please like and share this video. It's a way that you can help to get word out about it. And also like, subscribe, and follow First United Methodist Church of Baton Rouge on social media. See you next time, everyone.